Welcome to the course, Culturally Responsive Built Environments. So, today we are going to talk about culture, climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction. In the series of culture and risk, we have covered a lot on the disaster aspect of it, from the tsunami case study to the Kiruna case study where the culture plays an important role. Now we take a larger set of it, the climate change adaptation and why we are unable to integrate the climate change adaptation and the disaster risk reduction. And what is the role that culture plays in it, the deeper roles into it. So that is what I just give you a gist of. In fact, my own professor's work, Regina Mopau Lim. So a gist of her work and as well as my work on integrating climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction, and my ongoing work, especially the adaptive vernacular settlements. So when we talk about disasters and climate change, one of the important report, if we can look into it, the Center for Epidemic Diseases, the report, the CRED report has actually talks about, it actually gives a mapping of the intensity of the disasters, the number of natural disasters. So if you look at it, the Mexico part of it, and if you look at the India and the Chinese component, the Asian component of it. So it's almost, the EMDAT has recorded the 240 climate related disasters per year before 2000 when compared to 341 per year, there is a 44% increase. And if you look at the increase in disaster frequency was largely due to a sustained rise in number of climate related such as storms and floods. And then if you look at if you categorize the number of disasters which are climate related and which are geophysical related and look at the scale, this is much of the climate related, climatological, hydrological, which could be floods, and the meteorological. So this particular phenomenon of the climate induced disaster is on rise, and in fact many studies, many international conventions and frameworks, especially the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, also talks about how the whole world is in alarming rate. How the number of disasters are increasing and what are the main factors for it. So that is where the global rise in temperature levels and as well as what is the relationship between a disaster risk and the climate change. So it is not that because disaster talks about one particular place which was affected by an earthquake or a flood or a tsunami, but here the climate change. So the root cause of it brings back to the climate change, how it is gradually bringing changes. And even the IPCC report which talks about that you have the climate aspect of it and putting the disaster risk in the center and vulnerability aspect and how the settlements are exposed to the weather and climate events. So this whole conceptual understand, you have the greenhouse gas emissions on one side and you have the existing vulnerable conditions on one side, and so that is where it is causing the anthropogenic climate change. So all these conventions, all these efforts in the past decade have really focused on how we can link the climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction. So there is a very immediate need to bring these components together. And this is actually the image which you are looking at. It's a kind of conceptual approach of this REX report. So when we talk about the disaster risk reduction, you have the risk assessment. That is where the local knowledge is also considered into it, and the scientific knowledge, and the dialogue between the insiders and the outsiders, which means the internal and the external agencies, which we talk about the communities, the local groups, the target groups, as well as the outside actors, the NGOs, scientists. So how we can develop a dialogue, and then how from assessment to the communication and how we can take down to the action. So that is where we talk about the bottom up and how we can interface top down initiative. This is what all we are talking about, the disaster risk reduction initiatives. And Begum talks about two components of disaster risk management. So I just want to give you a clarity on how different authors have contributed in defining the DRR and DRM and DM, which is disaster management. So she analyzes that there are two important components in the disaster risk management. So it brings the management philosophy into it, and then within that, the risk reduction. DRR is the concept and practice of reducing disaster risks through systematic efforts to analyze, manage, and casual factors of disasters. The one which I just showed you is basically a kind of DRR, how we can assess, how we can develop a dialogue, how we can put it into the action. So that's a systematic process to know and analyze the casual factors of disaster. Whereas the disaster management follows 4 different phases, including the mitigation, preparation, response, and the recovery. So that is when we talk about these 4 different phases, that is where the DRM goes beyond DRR by adding a management perspective into it, how this whole set of 4 principles are managed. From the Indian context, when we talk about the National Action Plan on Climate Change from the Government of India, which have focused on 8 national missions. One is the National Solar Mission, National Mission on Enhanced Energy Efficiency, National Mission on Sustainable Habitat, National Water Mission, National Mission on Sustaining Himalayan Ecosystem, National Mission for Green India, National Mission for Sustainable Agriculture, National Mission on Strategic Knowledge for Climate Change. You heard about 8 missions, but the reality, they have set up their own domains, they have set up their network, they have set up their goals to how to achieve it, the whole operational aspect has been framed out. But then, this is where again I bring back to the emphasis of even the Hugo framework for action from 2005 to 2015 of the ongoing climate change negotiations have led to a, that is where they talk about there is a need for great attention to integrate DRR and CRA, both conceptually as well as in practice at regional, sub-regional, and national, and even the international. So that is where we talk from the local to the international level, how we can have that kind of collaborations. And it talks about the UNISDR talks about the functional linking of DRR and CCA within the context of poverty reduction. So the moment we are talking about vulnerability, the moment we are talking about the target group, obviously it also talks about linking with the poverty reduction. So however, there are different 8 missions which we talked about it, but there is a very little focus on how we can actually integrate the DRR in these different missions. And although this action plan is an important tool, how they can be coordinated with each other, but I mean how they can be coordinated within that mission may be well planned. But unfortunately, what we cannot see a ground reality is how these different missions can also be coordinated with each other, within which very limited indicators of DRR that ought to be integrated with CC are not well laid so far. So this particular missions, they are independent on their working on their own, but then how they could be having a contribution to the DRR and the climate change aspect, that is where even the policy level thinking also have to be brought down. John Berkman and some of the scholarly experts who worked on the management aspect of it, and that is where they brought, and the policy level thinking, they brought various challenges, differences and challenges for integrating the DRR and CCA. So in fact, one talks about the scales, because in both the things, if you talk about, there is a difference between a hazard and a disaster. Hazard just simply happens, but disaster creates an impact. But here, one is we are talking about the relatively shorter and smaller scales, but here we are talking about the longer and temporal and larger spatial scales. Whereas it have both positive and negative, and it talks mainly on the negative effects of it, mostly in a top-down approach, but it also talks about the bottom-up approach. Whereas the common challenges, the multi-stakeholder participation, and this is a multi-scale coordination. So here scale is an important aspect. Like for instance, when we talk about the scale mismatches, when the tsunami happened in the Banda Aceh in Indonesia, so what we actually talked, what the agencies have talked, is actually the recovery of the Banda Aceh or a particular place. when we talk about the Sweden, if you talk at the SMHI data, Swedish Meteorological Department, and where we get the amount of snow cover has been how it is gradually changing in these years. So which is a long time process, or maybe at least for the past 5 years or 10 years, how gradually the amount of snow cover is changing. Now, when we talk about that kind of change, are you anywhere relating to the impact which is going to cause immediately? Definitely not, because it is going to it is gradually changing, but then that kind of understanding, this is a long term impact. So but long term impact might be stressful. So how we can actually, similarly, if we talk about the coral reefs, the IPCC report, which are the places which has been more in a positive effect and a negative impact. So if you look at it, most of the coral reefs, which in the Millennium Ecosystems Assessment as well, they talked about how much coral reefs have been damaged. And here I want to bring, when I talk about the coral reefs, when I talk about the larger scale and the smaller scale of disaster and the larger scale of climate change, and what is the role of culture here? So this is where I want to bring one of the important contributions. It's not exactly focusing on climate change and disaster risk, but at least it talks about the cultural aspect of it, and from there what we learn into the discussion of climate change and disaster risk reduction. So one was Regina Mapau-Lim's PhD work on Philippine cultural identity and traditional settlements in development. So she talks how it comes to terms with cultural diversity in nation state. So what she developed was, she developed a kind of she coined a term called cultural environment, which is a kind of matrix of various structures that create identity. Like for instance, you have the religion, belief system, ecological environment, economy, family structure, kinship, gender, politics, cultural interaction. Based on this, what she have developed is she identified she applied the kind of cultural geography to identify various zones within the Philippines as a nation. You can look at based on the culture and the ecosystems map, and also how different language groups are also focused. You have the mountainous culture on the top, you have the kind of mainstream culture, and you have the sea culture here, the Tagbanua's sea culture. So this is where the more of the coral reefs. So she talked about over 7,000 islands which comprises the whole Philippines. There are over 120 ethno-linguistic groups that contribute to inhabit traditional settlements spread over the archipelago. And then these vernacular settlements are located in different terrains, and each of them have their own unique ecosystems through which the people have generated their creative economies and the ways of living, particularly to a culture based on a mountain culture, based on a sea culture, based on a plain culture, and they develop their own dialects of their language and identify with particular cultural groups. So what she developed was, she developed a kind of conceptual framework for analysis which talks about the structures which create identity, which include the shared experiences, the collective memory of a group, and the geographical conditions, and the economy, the language, the social structures. And she, based on the geographical component, how she classified into upland cultures and the riverine and the coastal, the plain lands of it. So that is how she classified, and she developed various methods into it. On the other hand, she talked about the concepts of identity, which include the cultural landscape, both at a local and regional level, how the belief systems contribute into it, nationalism, imagined communities, and the globalization. And similarly, when we talk about the change, obviously development plays an important contributor. That is where we talk about the classical development model, the vulnerability of traditional settlements, the globalization. Whereas in the classical development model, where we have how the existing vulnerable conditions and how the globalization had created an impact. Whereas the development in a cultural context, we have the local identities in a national context and the local identities in a global context. So this is how the overall framework she developed, and she applied a much more qualitative research where the kind of with a deeper anthropological approach. So a few cases I'll just give a glimpse of her work. And in her mountain culture, especially what you can see here in Sadanga, in the mountain culture, So there's all the rice and the paddy zones where people, they settled and they have the indigenous systems of laying the paddy farms, especially in the terrain slopes. And when we look at these kind of things, obviously there are certain indigenous practices, because most of these are settled where the irrigation, where the water bodies are present, where the irrigation aspect is, where there is a scope for irrigation, and that is where much of the community have actually developed their the way they how they organize the festivals, the way they have the patriarchal or the matriarchal societies. So how they transfer the land from the ownership from one to another, and how they conduct as per the seasons, how their rituals as per the seasonal aspects. Like for example, what you can see here is pig is considered as one of the sacred animal for them. So in fact, there were many oral testimonies which talk about when a man sees the pig, he considers that that is a place he should possess, because he considers this as a sacred animal. And especially the farmers, they also conduct, especially during the harvesting times, marriage occasions. So what they do is they sacrifice these pigs and they give a feast to the laborers on the village communities. And what you can see in this photograph is a kind of the rice bundles and the pig's jaws. So these animal bones are the symbolic representations of the ritual feasting. And it actually, this tradition of ritual feasting by wealthy members of the community also symbolizes a practice that reinforces the egalitarian qualities to maintain their rice producing culture, and it's also the way how a wealthy family distributes its wealth, whatever the accumulated wealth, and how they distribute to the other people. At the same time, it's the family's privilege to work diligently accumulating animals to be butchered for the community to share. So that is what it's not that you just keep on accumulating, but you just have to share, so that it is a mutual cooperation comes from the other side as well. And that's where one cannot accumulate wealth and not share it for the task of rice production, which requires the sharing of labor and community cooperation in order to bring in the harvest. So that is how certain practices also contributes to the sharing of occupation. And there are also, in fact, there are many rituals which are performed, and the local gods appeal to for the protection of the rice crop. And Padanga language is mostly used for these rituals. And also there are many frequent wars between the existing tribal groups. So obviously there are certain conduct these rituals and to negotiate the numerous peace pacts, which talks about their water boundaries and the rights relative to their neighbors. So in fact, it's all very well organized with the way the rituals are conducted, how they distribute water, how they distribute waters and their irrigation channels, and the low-lying, the distribution of channel from the high level to the low level. And mostly these kind of water rights have been the cause of tribal wars, because that is the most important resource to the cultivation of rice. Without, entire settlement could be starved. So that is where they developed a management system, how they manage the existing natural resources. And I'll show you a small film.
la na ga ha lo
So you can see that even the kind of granaries, how they store and how the whole ritual process has been organized within the community and again across communities, also talks about the common shared systems and how they share the land. The elders plays an important role. So in fact, with Sadanga identity, it actually is closely associated with the rice culture and with the larger cultural landscape of it, where we talk about when we talk about their identity, it is closely tied to a place and the economy or a way of life, so which has provided the meaningful practices to the whole community. And in fact, many have now in the present context, what happened is there was a change of religions, Christianity came into practice, and as well as many of the people who have become professionals, some people have migrated to some other Tubak region, and now if you look at their granary storages, they are not constructing anymore the traditional ones, but they are more into the tin models, and as well as people becoming professionals. So that is actually having an impact on the rice economy. So all these practices, the inheritance practices, how from father to the elder son and from mother to the elder daughter, how it transfers. Then what happens to the younger one? So the younger one was allowed to practice in what the parent have procured earlier, or in the community own lands, and then he have more chance to grow because he can still develop his rice crops. So that is one case. And the second case, what you look at in the kind of the coastal culture, where we can talk about the Tagbanwas in the Coron Island. So there's a group of islands, and actually in the Coron Island, what you can see is the Kayagan Lake in the center of Coron Island. And so here the people practice the fishing is their main occupation, and especially the octopus and varieties of fish. And now in her study, in Regina's study, many of the oral testimonies talks about how their indigenous understanding of the river, the sea and the fish, and how the sacred fishing grounds have been identified by the local people, and how they practice in such a way that it produces a sustainable fishing techniques, and so that it will not affect the habitat as well as nature. So that is the kind of, like for instance, you can see that they used to map certain sacred areas, because that is where certain myths they talk about the giant octopus used to live, and try not to go there. And at the same time, the traditional methods of fishing, how they go around and when to go and how to go, this kind of whole. So one of the map which talks about the limits of their ancestral understanding, especially with the known fishing grounds and the sacred grounds and the myths associated to it. So in fact, a small oral testimony by one of the interviewer from Regina's study is the Panyan, or the sacred area, is a home to the giant octopus. My father taught me to avoid these places. It is a forbidden place. None of the indigenous Tabanwa would go to these sacred places because they respect and recognize it. So when one goes to these places, the giant octopus holds onto the boat and sinks it till it drowns. So there is a fear established in people. Don't go there. If you go there, your boat will get sink down. When in sacred places, one must remain quiet and sometimes ask permission for being there. Now, Avoy Karbao Kalis have sacred places, Panyan, where there is Manalabiot, a large octopus with 7 or 3 large tentacles. Anyone can go to these places, the elders speak. Do not mind this person, he is from here. a Tagbanwa, do not harm him. If a prayer is not intoned by elders, a sickness will occur. So basically, there is a saying how elderly people, how they pray that he is a member of our community, don't do anything. So obviously there is a lyrics, also talks about a certain fear, and that is how they don't go within. And there's a small film, it's actually kind of edited from what Regina have actually done because of the time concern, and you can see how the underwater, the reefs, and how the fishing patterns, and how the traditional lifestyles have been conducted.
Talagang ano na namin sa aming mga ninuno, yun ang kanilang anak buhay, dagat, pangingisda. Kaya hanggang sa ngayon, yun na rin ang aming nakasanayan na anak buhay. Pwede rin kami anak buhay sa iba, pero hindi na namin masyadong kasi talaga yung alam namin dagat lang.
Ang patakaran ng katutubo, yung pamamaraan sa panghuli ng isda, kung paano maging hindi maubos halimbawa yung mga similya. Ginagawa po na namin yan dito sa Coron Island, katulad ng pagkukuha namin ng mga lamang gubat, mga pagkain sa gubat, o kaya mga gamit sa gubat. Yung tinuturo na kagad namin sa mga bata. Para pag sila na lang halimbawa dito sa aming pulo, alam na nila yung mga patakaran.
Ngunit dayag lang. Walang makina.
Kailan po nag-umpisa dito na nagkaroon ng yung bangka na maliliit? Kasi noon balsa lang.
Ngayon na lang.
Tatawag ka ng matanda.
Oo, pag ipanalangin ng matanda, pinapasalamatan sa Panginoon na binigyan ako ng bawl. Binigyan ako ng makina na sakyan ko para ikabubuhay sa aking pamilya. Para mapanganak buhayan ko ng habagat.
Pasasalamat.
Salamat.
Saka para hindi ka kukunan ng mga pugitang malalaki. Para wag tumaob yung bangka mo.
Oo, para huwag tumawag. Palaging swerte.
Palaging swerte.
Palaging swerte.
Yung panghuli noon ng matatanda, bato sa pugita. Yung pugitang bato. Yun ang panghuli ng matatanda.
Ito, pagkatapos na linisan na ganyan, kabitan ng pabigat, kabitan ng tingga, pagkatapos yung tingga, kawil, saka itong palikpik niya, swivel, kompleto ito. Meron pa yung tali dito, mga taling kunting nylon, maliliit. Kailangan yung swivel, hindi rin siya sobrang mahigpit. Pag mahigpit ito, hindi siya ikot. Mahina yung ikot niya. Kailangan yung swivel maluwag na konti. Pag hindi maluwag, dito mahina rin ang ikot niya.
Tungkol sa pagpintura naman.
Sa pagpipintura naman, walang problema, basta napinturahan. Kailangan din sa pintura yung kulay din ng kursunada ng pugita. Kasi pag hindi kursunada ng pugita yung kulay, kahit mag-apong kang hila-hila dyan sa laot, hindi abulin yan.
Mag-alis ka dito sa bahay. Pag sinigawan ka, ayan daw malas.
Anong bubungan niya? Nabungan pa na nga.
Pumagsay
kuan may pagpakdo nga may lito na.
Nanay ni tatay, galit na sa akin.
10.
Nahandang ako, bulok na matalim.
Pagkatapos pa natin dito.
Kung ako'y patayin,
Patay.
huwag mo lang biglayin.
Dito sa tapat ng mata.
Magtingin sa akin.
Dalawa yung sure, pwede na.
Tuloy-tuloy. Pag natanim na, anong susunod na gagawin?
Linisan.
Araw-araw.
Araw-araw.
Tapos, pagka 3 buwan,
Bilad na sa araw.
bilat na. Gano'ng katagal binibilat?
Kung mainit, mga 4 na araw. So yun. Ngayon talagang matagal. Kasi talagang binili.
Ari, anin. Wala. Ayun lang, medyo lang. Wala ba, may tuwalo na pa? Kira. Ari, anin. Yung tinagpano yung nakata. Ari, anin.
Now, in the present generation, especially after 1970s, what happened was there's a new trades, especially from the colonization, especially from the colonization from the Western countries, how they brought the new trades, fishing trade, and how they adopted new techniques, advanced fishing techniques, which are not always environment friendly. For instance, some of them use dynamite, some of them use fish nets that catch even a very small fish fry. And then the pounding of the coral reefs to drive fish into the nets all created problems of overfishing and the destruction of the environment where the fish live and multiply. So their breeding places, they got destructed because coral reef is such a natural resource, and because of these illegal activities and as well as improper fishing techniques, which have not really concerned about the nature and the locals, have really brought destruction to the environment. And moreover, the foreign fishermen who migrated from different places, who were not at all concerned about of their, this particular place, because they are neither from this place, so they just came to catch the fish and go away. So when the fish is gone, they move on. So this kind of processes, Tagbanwa myths have no relevance with these foreign fishermen, especially they don't bother about what these communities believe about it. And in the process, what happened was there was a competition established, and even the local Tagbanwa tribe also talks about, they try to develop and learn new fishing techniques which are against their their belief systems. So as a result, and at the end of the day, due to tourism aspects of it and how the locals also talk about consideration of the tourism into that particular area. So what you can see is the photograph, the impact, an underwater video which talks about the damaged reefs which had been dynamited, and they also been poisoned by sodium cyanide, which used to bring the live fish. So this is the kind of destruction what today's the natural environment is. And one of the main changes which how people are more concerned about is the impact of tourism on birds' nest production, because to make that bird's nest it takes some time, but then how the Chinese industries have also started capturing that. And the diminishing fish catch caused by the illegal fishing technique. Earlier they used to get fish in the nearby, but now they have to travel for a long distances to get the fish. And the careless attitudes of people who do not have a long-term interest in protecting the land and the sea, who provide a livelihood for Tagbanwa people. So now it become a kind of global aspect of it. The economy has become a global aspect where the sustainable measures of the local communities have completely disappeared. So this is just a few stories of climate change adaptation, how the local culture plays an important role to produce sustainable measures to adapt. And when we talk about the second aspect, the spatial scale challenges. So in fact, we have very good scientific knowledge databases. One talks about a much bigger scale on the global scale or a national scale, or but then some talks about the local scale, which is disaster scale. So this is where the two scales talks very differently. There is other also political aspect to it. For example, you got a flood in Kosi River or a drought in Bihar. It may not be the reason in Bihar, but it might be reason from somewhere where the dam is constructed in China on the Brahmaputra River. So which means politically it is not in our hands, but how the international logistics have to be worked out, because the reason lies in some other country, but the impact is seen in some other country. So that is where we see the mismatch between horizontal scales and the vertical scales, between not only the regions but between the countries. And the temporal and functional challenges, where we talk about the temporal challenges, because NGOs, the municipalities, the way the municipalities work is very different because they are continuous. But the agencies come forward for any relief or a restoration process, they work, they deliver, and then they leave. So which means they come on a contract, their visas are on a particular contract, but what happens after that? Who will maintain that? Who will take care of, who will get that link into the development? That is the temporal challenges. And amount of funding is also limited because the focus of the project is very limited, and the contractual agreements. So when we talk about the mismatches regarding the norms, fourth aspect of it, if we look into the climate change understanding and disaster risk reduction, when we talk about disasters and development, this is where in the 1980s Frederick Cunney brought the link between the disasters and the development. So many scholarly experts have classified into the first era in 1980s to 2000s. That is where it was seen as an environmental problem. It was talks about more of a greenhouse gas emissions, where scientific community was involved. In the second era, in the late after 2000s, this is where the unavoidable effects of climate change were acknowledged. So that has become an international agenda. And the social scientists and the development agencies have increased their cooperation in the second era. In the third era, because the causes and effects of the climate change are produced and felt with different regions of the world, so a question of global justice in the near future, that is the third era, where the legal experts come into the picture and the ethical experts come into the third era. So development of legislative, cultural or behavioral norms which determine the functioning of human society and how the interactions between nature, society were created. So many of the legislative norms are often violated, especially the coastal regulation zones, which do exist from 1991, but how much they have been followed in reality. The knowledge mismatches. When we talk about the scales of knowledge and work applied by the risk scientists and the practitioners, and it actually doesn't bring the, like for instance, when I did my study in Hudhud cyclone area, which is an ongoing project, where we could see that the planning department prepares the master plan for it, but when we ask for to what extent you have considered the data which has been given by the Department of Statistics, that is a statistical data. But when you talk about the master plan, to what extent you linked it with the master plan preparation of master plan process, which means this department only talking about the impacts and the numbers of productions of agriculture or any other thing, but to what extent it converts into a physical plan, or how it can framed into a local development plan. So that is where a coordination is required. How to use a macro level knowledge set to inform the micro level data set, and who should take into consideration in what way a clear roadmap is needed for better integration of climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction. So this is how we just talked about the scale mismatches. One talks about the actual disaster event, one talks about the long-term implications. The spatial scale, it talks about the regions or the prone areas, it talks about the global or a continental or intercontinental area. And the temporal, which talks about the short term, and this talks about long term adaptation strategy, and also the functioning of agencies and the scope of work and the funding limitations. And mismatches regarding the norms. It could be a norm which talks about the whole coastal regulation. It could be a norm which talks about a city development, and the standards and even the bylaws. So that is how it is done. And this is where Lee and Wang develops a 6W framework, why adaptation is needed for natural disaster risk, what is adaptation to disaster risk, and adapt to what, and who should adapt, how to adapt, and what are the possible principles or criteria to assess the effectiveness, because we have to measure the effectiveness of that adaptation process. And this is where we talked about the spatial scale. This is where the Ian Bentley's work of space-time framework will also address the gap. How we can, and this is where the present of my work, which is talking about the adaptive vernacular settlements work, where we bring the different spatial scales from micro to the macro level and bring the vulnerability assessments from micro to meso levels, and how the coordination and cooperation both between these political, technological, ecological, educational, cultural institutions, and how this participation and communication is also working out. So that is where we talk about the culture plus ecology, and we talk about the pre-disaster, during disaster, post-disaster, and the future disaster. So both it addresses short-term strategies and the long-term strategies. So this is how it's ongoing work, so which I could update in the following any other future forum. So that's it. Thank you very much.